Hey, welcome back, everybody, to another session of Bourbon Bytes. I'm Terry McGraw from Cape Endeavors Incorporated, and your not so humble host. Today, I am joined by the Chief Executive Officer of Supply Wisdom, Jenna Wells. Jenna, thank you very much for being part of our podcast. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Really excited to be here. Thanks, Terry.
No worries. Hey, so Jenna, you have a pretty interesting sort of ascension path to becoming a CEO in corporate America. You were a Marine officer at one point. You worked at the NSA, so you've had some governmental and military experience, as well as now you're in the commercial sector. So could you give a little bit more color to your background and sort of how you arrived, you made that path to all the way up to Chief Executive Officer?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a long time, but yeah, quite an interesting and humbling journey along the way. So, Marine Corps officer commissioned out of Purdue University. So did a 4-year ROTC program at Purdue. Was thankful enough to be selected as a signals and ground electronic intelligence officer, where we do our training at the NSA in Baltimore. So very unique experience, even, going through the Marine Corps training to have that ability to train directly at the NSA. From there, spent some time at Camp Pendleton in California, had the incredible privilege to take a platoon of Marines to Afghanistan during 2011 and 2012, and then came out and really did my transition into the civilian sector. And I think, especially the intelligence training, gathering, and a lot of that ended up translating, I think, quite nicely into a risk management career. So my first corporate job was in downtown Boston. It was at Wellington Management. So they're a global asset management firm. And I started managing 18 of their 24/7 global command centers. Everything, from their CCTVs to their intelligence gathering to their BCP and DR. And that quickly translated into their third-party risk management program. Because as I'm sure we'll discuss later, outsource was booming at that time, and the outsourcing of functions. So I spent 5 incredible years at Wellington, had the opportunity to work with a lot of regulatory agencies, and also to extensively travel throughout Europe and Asia, so multinational experience. From there, I literally moved across the street to take over the third-party risk management program at Iron Mountain. For those who, I'm sure everyone listening knows Iron Mountain, basically everyone's favorite, supplier. Iron Mountain services most locations in the world as a critical supplier and is in 50 plus countries with over 50,000 vendors. So, a very, very large purview in a very large risk landscape that we needed to manage with that program. And that was an incredible experience as well. And then joined Supply Wisdom after we closed our Series A fundraise in 2022. And, that was such an interesting journey. I knew the founder of Supply Wisdom from my time transitioning out of the Marine Corps. He was incredibly supportive of veterans who had recently transitioned to the corporate world. They had just closed, their first investment round, so they were growing, which was very exciting. And I was actually one of the first beta testers for the platform when I was at Wellington. And what really drew me there was the ability to influence and help to grow a product that I would use as a practitioner. And I think that's a very unique experience in corporate America. So throughout Supply Wisdom, I started on what we called the risk and resilience team at the time, where I really, kind of tried to bridge that gap between our customers and practitioners and our product and tech team on, to continue to bring value and make sure that the product was solving the needs of our everyday customers, which are also continuing to evolve with the political landscape and the regulatory landscape and the ESG landscape. So from there, I was able to take over the customer success team. We had we saw a lot of success with expansions with existing customers. We were growing. I soon absorbed the entire go-to-market function of the product team as the COO. And this past summer, had a huge, incredibly humbling opportunity and honor to take over the company. So that's kind of where I am now. And, just a little bit about Supply Wisdom so everyone knows kind of what I do. But we are a risk intelligence platform that covers 7 domains. So really, any single domain that maybe you would historically use a siloed tool to look at cyber, location, ESG, we look at all of that together with, hundreds of risk indicators to truly give you a holistic picture of your outsourced supply chain, which, as I'm sure we'll discuss, is getting riskier every single day.
Yeah, so
Long-winded, but that's a little bit about my background.
no, I mean, well, it's an impressive journey in a very short period of time.
Thank you.
I remain humbled by the guests that I have on here. I always seem to find folks that have managed to really skyrocket in a very short period of time, and you are one. A little bit about supply wisdom for the folks that may not know how that can help them. So we have a customer base that's largely defense industrial based, but they have to struggle with supply chain management, things like CTPAT and OFAC requirements, et cetera. How
Absolutely.
does supply wisdom fit into that portfolio, man? Like, how do they mitigate risk, and how do they use something like supply wisdom in there to help them do that?
Great question. So really, I think I will start with, the adage that you can outsource the function, you can never outsource the risk. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really the first thing when we're talking, to companies that we really enhance and hone in on that subject. And when you do outsource a function, you need to look holistically across many different domains that function might provide. Right. So you need to make sure, based on what the function is doing, that they have the appropriate cyber posture from the OFAC or compliance perspective, that they are not on any sanctions list, which if you watch the news, those lists are changing daily. Countries based on geopolitical tensions. From an operations perspective, where are they operating out of? It is a country that has experienced, severe weather, geopolitical tensions, might be sanctioned. And all of that from a location perspective as well. Are you looking at one location that has maybe multiple critical suppliers that are located? And historically, in risk management, and a lot of the software tools are available, there's these great tools that go very, very deep into those one or single domains, right? So you might have one tool that's looking very deep into compliance. They're looking at PEP checks and OFAC screenings and sanctions lists. But they're not looking at the cyber posture. So you're using another tool to look at the vulnerabilities, the patch management. Have they had any breaches? Then you're using another tool to look at the negative news, the operational impacts. And that's great.
Mm-hmm.
But in this incredibly fast paced world, that takes a lot of time. So you're paying for multiple tools. You're probably utilizing human analysts to aggregate that
Mm-hmm.
data and normalize it, and then other platforms like a Tableau, a Power BI to then report up. So what Supply Wisdom does is looks across all 7 domains. So we review ESG, compliance, operations, financial, location, nth party, and cyber domains. So you are getting one platform that is identifying hundreds of risk indicators for each of those domains, reporting on those in a multitude of ways that you can consume the data. You can feed it into your GRC platform, you can receive an SMS, you can receive an email, and then you can also start to slice and dice from an analytical perspective to change your risk management posture from reactive to proactive. So really, it's an intelligence platform that looks holistically across all risk domains to give you that one true picture of where you need to be focusing your time and attention in this incredibly volatile world.
So that's actually brings me to sort of my next question on the very volatile globe. And we always seem to believe that we live in the most turbulent times, and I think through history, um, certainly the 20th and the 21st century has been a notable amount of geopolitical consternation globally. But here we are on the tail end of so the Russian and Ukraine invasion, and we found that for some folks was incredibly disruptive, especially if you had manufacturing, et cetera, in the Ukraine. But as we look to other geopolitical environs, particularly around China and maybe even Taiwan, so what do you basically what your thoughts on the geopolitical environment? How should one in the corporate world think about this in terms of risk and risk management, and then eventually risk mitigation strategies?
I think you just hit on probably the topic that I like to talk about the most, interestingly
Mm-hmm.
enough, which is location risk. And I feel like that's still kind of a taboo domain, for lack of a better term, in the risk management world, right? So we talked about those, siloed single domain monitoring tools. But on top of that, you need to be monitoring the locations that your outsourced services are operating out of. Not only where your company's offices might be or delivery locations, but the locations of your supply chain vendors. And I think to your point, Terry, that was a huge piece that was missing from a lot of risk management programs when Russia invaded Ukraine. And, to even think back before the official invasion day, they started amassing their tanks on the Belarusian border. So you needed to not only know, did you have a vendor in Russia or Ukraine? Did you have a vendor in Belarus? Because that was about to be sanctioned by the US government and a lot of Western governments as well. And that was such an important piece. So you did not see disruptions in either your production or your supply chains. And hopefully that you could, enact your BCP and DR plan and move to a different location. And then you see, the follow. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
No. I was just saying, and then even the follow-on effects where, I think location post-COVID, which I still know there is COVID, but really, post the shutdown of 2020, that is when it really started with locations. But 2022 with Russia invading the Ukraine reinforced it. And then you're still seeing it day to day. Look what just happened with Cambodia. It was almost a blip on our news screens, but that is now an area where there are simmering tensions. India, Pakistan was in the news, for about a week. And those are two nuclear powers and also one of the largest outsourced tech and HR areas of the entire globe. China, Taiwan, semiconductors, chips, tariffs, Israel, Hamas.
It brings me to mind. It does. I think that around that geopolitical sort of turbulence, you and I missed each other in Afghanistan and at the NSA, but we both understand that when particularly kinetic warfare, when nations go to blows, it's not just those two nations. It has effect on all of the geopolitical regions that are around it. And so I'd like to get your thoughts. Well, let's assume you mentioned that the BRIC nations, and I think that's important. But we do have a concentration of supply of chip manufacturers in a particular region, and let's assume for a moment that China decides to act on Taiwan. Your experience globally and how this has a ripple effect. It's not just, those chip manufacturers, Vietnam, Cambodia, those are all very, very, very tightly bound in that geopolitical region. And it's not like you can just isolate the effects in one region, as you mentioned with Belarus and all the Commonwealth of Independent States after the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And not once, but twice, remember? We had this back in 2014.
I was going to say, everyone I feel like also forgets, this started in 2015 with Crimea. So there are all these leading indicators that something bigger is going to happen. And, we could talk about that all day as well, where, some of these simmering tensions, there have been indicators if you were monitoring location risk that I need to pay more attention to this and maybe I need to diversify my supply chain.
Right. And so, that's a good question. Diversification in supply chains that are fairly narrowly focused. So any thoughts? And I brought up chip manufacturing, but I think it's one of the more pertinent discussions. The electronics backbone of everything that we do, from OT to IT, and every other component of our business operations. Mitigation strategies. What are your thoughts on sort of a diversification in geopolitical regions that are very, very tightly coupled, but certainly have, I guess what I'm asking is, how do you diversify when you've got a concentration of that, the provisioning of that particular supply chain in a region that may be affected all at once?
Absolutely. So I think I'm gonna oversimplify the initial question. Is I think there needs, before you can diversify, you need to identify those locations where your supply chain is coming from. And we continually see, in a lot of times, incredibly large global organizations, they might know, via their AP list or their business relationship owners, contract reviews, what suppliers they're using, but not the service delivery locations. A headquarters is very different than a service delivery location. So I think the first step in diversification of that supply chain is the identification of all of those locations. And that's a huge piece, because once you identify where your services or where your goods are being shipped from, built, you name it, then you can identify concentration risk, right? You can see, okay, how many of this, and concentration risk can go incredibly deep. Is it concentration risk with an entire company, an entire industry, an entire country, right? Is the US, dependent on one country or two countries, and there are no other options? So maybe I need to bring in-house or start looking at onshore capabilities, which we know are usually much more expensive, but depending on the criticality of that service or that, physical good, to bring it onshore. Or, we've seen a lot of movement away from some of those Southeast Asian countries and bringing it to Latin America or Central America for some diversification away from those areas, which to not as mature manufacturing locations, but maybe a little quote unquote safer or less tumultuous at this time or historically, as some of those locations were traditionally, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Philippines. We've seen, some disruptions in the supply chain.
Yeah, I suppose the Latin America piece, I guess, depending on your perspective of turbulence, and
very, very true. I'm using turbulence probably in too broad terms. But I think truly, and we're seeing this now, we're always going to utilize offshore locations. That's just, that's not going to change, just simply because it would take years to be able to have the capability in some of those natural resources that we simply don't have here. But I can't stress enough, I truly think the first step in diversification is identification. You must know those locations.
Yeah, and I don't think we talk about identification enough. But it's not only in where we directly source, but as you said, this is a supply chain. It has downreach implications, and there's a moral and ethical component as we get further down that chain. For example, we talk a lot about the manufacturing of EVs and batteries, et cetera, largely sourced from regions of the world that still use child and slave labor, right? And so how does one ensure that not only are they meeting a regulatory environment, but is there moral and ethical components to where you're supplying? And so I'll give you an example. So and maybe you can help us sort of decipher this with key U.S. regulations like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Like we are trying to address the fact that some of where we get our supply chain do not operate in the same moral and ethical basis that we do. So do you have thoughts about how far down a corporation has to sort of research their supply chain before they've reached not only the legal ends of that compliance, but I guess we'll never be able to answer the true moral and ethical implications of that. But do you have thoughts on sort of the U.S. regulatory environment? How deep does that penetrate into your supply chain? And is that something also that Supply Wisdom helps sort of solve?
So yes to all of the above. I have so many thoughts. I feel like we could do, an entire podcast on this, and we absolutely, excuse me, can help. We've seen, sorry about that. We have seen customers, and I've personally done it in my life, go down to the 10th party. We call it nth party monitoring, but to truly track, this one example was for the destruction of IT equipment in a certain Latin American country. And not only the US ESG regulations, but the ESG regulations in that country, you needed to track every single vendor that touched that piece of equipment until it ended up in a landfill to prove at every step of the way you were taking care of the environment. So I think, you need to bring in, and this is where continuous monitoring is an absolute must. Where one, simply because of the complexities of these supply chains and how many nth parties there are, people can't do this. So you have to use the tools available, right? Like a Supply Wisdom, we are utilizing, advanced AI and ML. We have risk analysts that are backing up and training our engines continually, and we're scanning millions of data points daily. So when you can input your supplier and then those nth parties, you'll one, immediately be notified when there is an incident. If say it's an ESG incident, you'll be notified of the criticality, the location, and some recommended actions to take. And I think really it's a partnership between the monitoring company, but also between the business relationship owners at those customers or partners. Because again, you need to know and you need to identify those nth parties. And that's really a new concept where the easiest way to do it would be during that contractual phase, where you actually write in language saying you need to identify and notify us of any other third party vendor, OSP, we use them mostly synonymous, is going to be touching my data. And that you are adhering to X, Y, and Z regulation dependent on the location. And, the US, although we have our own regulatory environment here that we need to maintain, you also need to keep in mind the regulatory environment of the country that you're operating in. And it can be drastically different. And you can do that through continuous monitoring. And, you brought up some of the modern slavery laws, the anti-child slavery. And historically, a lot of the companies or functions that are more prone to breaking some of those regulations are suppliers that you wouldn't monitor. They might be your tier 3, 4 non-critical suppliers. But if you're not proactively monitoring those, you can be out of compliance. And not only from a regulatory perspective, a massive reputational
So let's pivot to that a little bit, if you don't mind. All of these laws sort of have a basis in a sort of our moral and ethical behavior and our obligations thereof. And but let's talk about the risk of not doing this and doing this to the degree that you're legally bound to be. So, for example, SEC, getting out of whack with the SEC or any one of these U.S. laws or European laws. What's the ramification financially or legally for companies not to do this well? We know there's an operational risk, of course, with ransomware, et cetera. We'll get into that in a minute. But just looking at the impacts potentially financially to a company or legally, what are they faced against if they don't do this well?
Sure. I think the reputational piece is something you can never quantify. But from a fiscal perspective, one, laws have been introduced since about 2017 where people, specifically the CFO, can be held personally liable if some of these global regulations are not adhered to. So there is personal liability from a professional perspective that's very, very new that, not only can you lose your job, there can be serious ramifications. And then also fiscally in the form of fines. When GDPR was first introduced for data protection, and you needed to ensure that, steps were taken if you were operating in certain European countries, there were millions of dollars of fines that followed if you did not show adherence to that law. Recently in January, the Digital Operational Resiliency Act and was introduced in EMEA, that you had to monitor your critical ICT suppliers continuously. And if you did not by a certain date, you faced regulatory fines, reputational issues, and the potential to not do business in certain areas. So there's so many domino and downstream impacts to not only track these changing, because these regulations are not going away. They're changing, they're evolving, and they're going to continue to do so. You need to stay aware of the regulatory environment and what's coming down the pipe with continuous monitoring as well.
Yeah, I think the whistling past the graveyard methodology that a lot of companies have endeavored upon are quickly going by the wayside. I do think that the regulatory environment is getting way more teeth than it has historically.
And I think it'll be so interesting where it goes with AI. I feel like Europe and APAC is traditionally, much ahead of the States with their regulatory changes and, new regulations. But AI is evolving so incredibly fast. I think that's the next thing, to watch out for. What are those AI regulations? And then every single person and company is using AI in some sort right now. How are you going to fastly or quickly ensure compliance with that and then be able to show that with evidence?
Well, yeah, I mean, we're already seeing the ramifications of so not only in the cybersecurity landscape, just from the threat perspective of the rapidity of evolution, but you've seen phishing campaigns reach a level of sophistication they never would have without these kind of capabilities with generative AI. We have voice faking, people calling in to get help desk resets using AI voice emulation. But then we have checks on reality. I think 2 years ago, it was pretty obvious to the naked eye what was AI generated.
Yes.
Recent commercials and recent clips, you can see them on any social media feed, have reached a level of sophistication where the eye really can't catch. I mean, other than the the Sasquatch videos and those things that were clearly AI, but you do have the ability now to alter reality. They're that good, right? I mean, a world leader, declaring war on another party that was AI generated has huge ramifications. I think the U.S. is kind of lagging and catching up with sort of tagging what is AI. So what are
Couldn't agree
the
more.
limitations of AI development? So is that something? Well, what are your thoughts on sort of that the mitigation strategies for those kind of topics?
Absolutely. So I think I can speak for Supply Wisdom, where we are partnering actually with we have a partner called Cranium that does AI monitoring. So we can
Mm-hmm.
ensure that we are responsibly using AI. And I think that's something that, again, to talk about a resilient supply chain and among all these geopolitical tensions, because I think you can bring it back to that, right? Where that AI of a world leader can have serious, consequences very quickly before
Mm-hmm.
it's disproven. So I think the questions as these regulatory environments are evolving and as agentic AI is evolving, it seems hourly at this point, ensuring that you are proactively working with your critical suppliers and that they are using AI responsibly. There are, organizations out there that don't know how AI is being used. And, AI is
Yeah.
making a lot of our lives easier. But if you're not a risk professional, you might not be thinking that, oh, everything that I'm ingesting, into this LLM or, what did
Right.
ChatGPT 5 come out Monday? Sunday, right? Or,
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
it's
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
how much HIPAA data has now been in there, right? So could I be in violation of GDPR? How are my contractual language needs to change? So I think that
Mm-hmm.
what companies need to be doing is proactively looking internal at their use of AI, but absolutely partnering with their critical suppliers in ensuring they are responsibly using AI. And that's something we feel very, very strongly at Supply Wisdom about, where we just went through a full AI review with our partner Cranium to make sure that we were using appropriate models, the best models, but also everything safely.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'll use it as a minor segue into sort of the cybersecurity piece here, because it is part. It's more specifically aligned to what we do, but certainly a huge component. If you look at things like SolarWinds and Kaseya and even the Microsoft attacks, they have huge ramifications downstream. I think what Kaseya hit 400 or maybe it was 4,000, I don't know, downstream vendors using that tool was now ingress points to their customer base. SolarWinds, same. Microsoft, clearly it's always pertinent to those. I mean, they're the
Mm-hmm.
900-pound gorilla. And so when you look at compromise upstream of SaaS platforms, software vendors, where you're trusting that that vendor is doing due diligence, and that when you're receiving patches, you're not actually receiving more malware, or you're not receiving more exploits for a 0 day, and so there's a trust upstream that we have to. So we have an obligation to look downstream, but now as corporate owners, we have an upstream problem set as well. How does one mitigate this, the risk from upstream compromises to supply chain? Is that something that you have thoughts on?
I think, and keep me honest if I'm answering your question correctly, but I
Mhm.
think again, it's about true holistic visibility. Because
Mhm.
whatever software you're using, the platform you're utilizing, I feel like we need to be talking about the software bill of materials way more than we do when we talk about supply
Mhm.
chain and vulnerabilities. But understanding what platforms or tools, software products you're using, what internal access they have, right? A lot of it's looking internally. What other systems are they connected to? Are they connected, to my contract management system, to my HR system, to my, X, Y, and Z? The documentation collection, have they gone through an independent attestation? Do they have a SOC 2? Do they have an ISO 27K? Have they gone through an external audit? But again, that outside view, holistically outside of cyber, I think can give you a very, very early indicator of the overall health of that company. And what I mean by that is we have seen many case studies where if you saw, there was one company, which I will not name, that had a cyber breach about 7 years ago. And we did a really detailed analysis on the 4 years prior to that breach, all the negative news across all domains. And what we saw was very, very sobering, where it started with a financial decline. So you saw, their quarterly financials over about a year period, nothing very, very steep, but there was a significant degradation quarter over quarter in their financial statements. So that, could have led to, okay, maybe they're having, they're not dedicating enough money to cybersecurity or to X, Y, and Z. It could have led you to ask some questions, right? Where I see this decline, are you still utilizing, the appropriate controls? Are you doing your pen tests, et cetera? So followed by the financial decline, you saw operational changes, you saw leadership departures, you saw some M&As with some smaller companies, and then you saw some challenges where they had significant customers leave. And the last piece was actually a fine by a regulator for unrelated to cyber. But all of these negative incidents, if you had been tracking continuously, being notified, would have shown an overall degradation in this vendor that you could, proactively or doing trend analysis say, this could be a problem. I need to check their cyber posture. I need to do an additional test that this is a safe vendor to use. So I think really it's looking holistically at over a period of time at these vendors to make sure that they are overall healthy. And that, to me, that's a good indicator that they are paying attention to their cyber posture.
It's fascinating you mentioned that because this is something that everyone in our field grapples with. Is you have inherited trusts, right? You have inherited capabilities, particularly when you're using SaaS provisioning, even if it's in FedRAMP, right? I mean, so I'll pivot a little bit. Jenna used to lead secure by design software initiatives while she was at CISA, and I do believe that there needs to be way more emphasis on the SaaS and software providers to be delivering secure code and secure methodologies for updating that code more than we've done. But you bring up some really fascinating data points on looking at the trends that would lead to, because it's a rather opaque problem, right?
Absolutely.
The users of these SaaS don't usually know they've inherited a problem until it's way too late. But the example you just gave, clearly, as a CEO of my own company, would clearly want those indicators of folks that I'm relying on upstream. Is that something Supply Wisdom can help with programmatically?
Absolutely. So what we do is, we monitor locations, so cities or countries, in conjunction with third parties. We call them targets. And the way that we view our dashboard and we allow you to configure is you can slice and dice the data however works for you, based on your vertical, your regulatory requirements, your risk appetite, your risk threshold, and you can start to see trending time over time in many different visual depictions. So, you can see and drill down, we have 7 domains, 150 sub-metrics actually feed those domains. So you can get down to that individual metric that you want to look at. Maybe it's for ESG and you want to see the carbon emissions for a certain supplier that you've been using, 7 months over 7 months, or, year over year over year, quarter over quarter. And what we allow you to do is slice and dice and analyze the data in real time based on your needs. And those start when you can do that look back, overlay it with an industry average or with your company average, you start to be able, to actually do predictive analytics and ask the questions of your vendors and identify vendors you might want to spend a little more time with, or that, you've seen a degradation in their overall risk score. So maybe I want to change vendors. So what we do is we allow our customers to utilize all of those data points on one dashboard to really see trends that lead to predictive analytics. And the biggest piece, proactive risk management. I mean, in 2025, you cannot be reactive anymore.
Well, and there's also all the largest frameworks that we use as compliance frameworks, whether that be 800, 171 that CMMC falls under, ISO 27001 and 2. You name the framework of cybersecurity, even SOC 2 and the financial sectors. There is a requirement to have business risk mitigation policy and strategy, and have it exercised, on some basis. Now, it's an organizationally defined value. It could be monthly, quarterly, yearly, but there is a clear description that this must be done
Yes.
if you are going to maintain any level of compliance. And it's very practical, common sense. I don't know how much more evidence one would need as a business leader to see that proper business risk management, is how we also have financial security. If you're not wanting to pay fines, you want to avoid operational disruption, you want to avoid reputational damage, and you want to ensure that you're not, a downstream of a compromise, you have to treat this holistically. And it's not something you can wish away. You need to treat this like a business function, business risk management. It's very hard. I'll get on my little diatribe. Very hard for cybersecurity and cybersecurity professionals often to articulate in a language that the board would understand as far as business risk and business risk mitigation. And it's a challenge. It's why we often see that the CISO is like, well, I begged and begged and begged for financing, but, I could never get it. It was never approved. We always had legacy stuff. It was deduplicated. The CFO cut my funding. We hear that a lot. But that doesn't really resonate with the SEC or other, the lawful entities that would be coming after you. So, business risk mitigation as a strategy and as a compliance mechanism. Do you see pushback, or are you seeing less pushback? Like, what's the adoption rate you're seeing across, sort of the corporate structure that they have to take this seriously now? This is not something we continue to wish away.
No, very interesting question. I think we're seeing the tides shift a little bit. And I think it is because of the geopolitical tensions. And the absolute biggest thing, we're seeing boards pay attention. And I think when, and as a risk professional, one of my biggest, I would assume you felt the same way. One of my biggest frustrations was, oh, well, you're a cost center, right? You're just a cost center, so we're not going to allocate. Well, I'm going to show you how yes, I'm a cost center, but I can potentially save you this amount of money, because if something happens, not only reputationally, financially, you're going to owe this. And this is probably going to be a fraction of what I'm asking for to appropriately do my job. Yep. Right? So we are seeing, again, a lot of it was post-COVID. And, think of, Log4j or, CrowdStrike. And it's the old adage of never let a crisis go to waste, which, hate to say, but you usually don't get, the attention until something happens. And then it's too late. You just have to go into mitigation and survival mode. So what we're seeing is board attention and that one holistic view when you have everything in one platform, like Supply Wisdom does, and the ability to report on that week over week, month over month, quarter over quarter, year over year, how your portfolio is trending has really been resonating and showing the value of continuous monitoring. So I think, it's still looked at as a cost center, unfortunately, but with the geopolitical tensions and all what we have seen in the news every single day post Russia, Ukraine, it cannot be ignored even at the board level anymore. It cannot. And, it's such an interesting push and pull where the world is incredibly volatile, but we are still seeing so much data that companies are outsourcing these critical functions at a breakneck pace. They're not slowing down. They are continuing to outsource core functions.
It's interesting, when you're trying to measure what matters, like any data is useful data in the decision making. You don't need a huge bunch of data set to start helping build metrics to quantify what that risk is and what the potential mitigation of it is as well. I think that the tools that you're providing folks are incredibly useful and long overdue in their adoption at most corporate environments. We do a little bit of talking. We call in a lot of our presentations. George Akerlof in 1970 created a paper on economics called The Market for Lemons. And he was describing an asymmetric marketplace where one party has all the information and another party has very little. And he used the used car market as an example. The car being sold, the person who has that car, whether it be a used car dealer or the owner, has all the information about how it's been taken care of, whether it's been abused, has the oil been changed, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And the person going to buy that does not have that information. They kick the tires, et cetera. And so there is an asymmetric information exchange. And anything you can do to level that playing field increases the viability of the market. If you don't do anything about it, people, move out of that market space, right? Mm-hmm. And so the what we saw in the used car market, it's very marginalized, right? And so the people who own peaches seek to either keep them or sell them the other way, and we see that that play out. And unfortunately, what we've seen in cybersecurity, and this goes directly to your point previously, cybersecurity and functions like cybersecurity are a margin hit. They don't add to the gross revenue of the company. They detract from that gross revenue. And so the only way that you can articulate the value of the cybersecurity mitigation strategies is to understand the risk profile that you're reducing or you're attempting to reduce. Absolutely. And what the economic impact is of not doing this, mm-hmm. right? Because that's the metric, is it's business risk, right? And so the risk is the residual of, here's my mitigation, here's my articulation of what it is, here's the potential damage it can inflict, here's all the things that I've done to mitigate it, here's my residual risk, am I going to accept it, offset it with insurance, et cetera. But heretofore, and solutions like yours, this has largely been left to practitioners to try to articulate that to the board, and they've often been very poor at it. And that's not a slam on them. It's just the nature of the beast. Cybersecurity is very esoteric. It is hard to quantify or qualify that to people who don't understand the ones and zeros of it and the potential risk involved. I think now with the prevalence of ransomware, businesses are now having that tombstone reaction, like, they're paying attention to it now because it's unavoidable. Yeah. But there's a series of these, and I think that solutions like Supply Wisdom, are long overdue. But I think now truly is a way to quantify and qualify that risk that makes these asymmetric marketplaces that George Akerlof articulated less problematic for us, particularly in the cybersecurity arena and supply chain risk. Thoughts on that sort of?
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely couldn't agree. And, I think that even thinking back to when I was on the practitioner side with, so much data, it still is very hard to articulate to senior management and to a board why this is necessary. And I still think until we had all of these events and these disruptions, that's when the light bulb moment went on. But I also think the increased regulatory pressure, right? Where you have these regulations now and we're all global, I feel like it doesn't matter how small your company is. Everyone has a global outreach now. And if you're not in compliance or you're not doing something like continuous monitoring, ensuring that your cybersecurity is up to standards, people will not do business with you. They literally, from a regulatory and a contractual perspective, you'll lose business. So we've been working with a lot of our customers and prospects on making sure we very, very clearly define that value proposition from a cost savings, a risk mitigation, a board reporting. That has been a huge piece. The analytical pieces and the ability to not have to, 3 weeks prior, put together this big, robust board presentation. It's click, download, PDF, and send. Because it's showing I am continuously monitoring this. This isn't a point in time.
Does Supply Wisdom, and if the answer is no, I'd like your help on it. Does Supply Wisdom help corporate leaders understand what regulatory environment they fall under? I mean, this is an evolving space, right? And I guess my last question was, what's the upcoming legislation that you're aware of, either in the US or, in EMEA, that folks should be aware of? But B, does Supply Wisdom help track the changes in the environment that I need to comply with? Is that part of the framework that you all have put in
We
place?
absolutely do in our location monitoring, because the location is tied
Mm,
directly to the regulatory environment. So that, I would say, is
okay.
one of the huge benefits of, again, the fact that we use an umbrella methodology, that our umbrella overlays that location monitoring with your third parties. So you are going to
Mm,
understand on a very granular demographic level the regulatory environment in that location that you're operating in. And then you are going to proactively receive notifications for changing regulations, evolving regulations. We have a whole DORA ebook. When, DORA was, I feel like I said DORA in my sleep in the first 6 months of 2025. But how can you use supply wisdom and our data to show DORA compliance? And that was a huge piece in helping our customers navigate a changing regulatory environment. So yes, that is a huge, huge piece of what we do. And, we have a team that we've purposely built of former practitioners on our product and solutions engineering side, because they understand what the customers are going through in this very, very evergreen and changing environment. And I'd say what we're focusing on most right now is trying to get our hands around the AI regulations and what that's going to look
mhm,
like. What the US
mhm,
just announced, where that's a super fluid, I would say, still, and how that's going to affect some of the EU regulations. DORA just has extended for non-ICT vendors. There's now requirements for that. So we're tracking closely some of the additions or changes that are happening with the Digital Operational Resiliency Act across Europe. But the biggest focus right now, and most of the questions we're getting, are around AI. And where do we think the
mhm,
regulatory environment is going? That's, what everyone wants to know, which I wish I knew. There's indicators that I think, the US is probably going to have less of a regulatory presence in AI than some of the rest of the world. But it's so incredibly fluid right now. We're just tracking it and reporting it. But I would say the changes to DORA in the requirements for non-ICT vendors is very top of mind, as well as the AI regulatory environment.
Yeah, I'm thinking of our final wrap up question. Like I don't know how someone does if you're larger than a few person operation. I don't know how you would do this without something like a supply wisdom to help you navigate. But if you're just sort of going to give a list of things that you should consider in the business risk profile, so that if supply wisdom or somebody else, you know if you were going to list the risks that they need to consider, geopolitical, vendor enumeration, regulatory environment. What is that list of key things that if I'm building my business risk, management from scratch today, what are the big topics I need to address? Whether or not supply wisdom can help them with that.
Sure. And I think, to kind of go back to the location question that we started with, identification of your
Mm-hmm.
vendor population. That is the absolute
Mm-hmm.
first thing. You must identify what vendors you are utilizing. And I guarantee you there are so many, ghosts in your vendor environment that you didn't know you were using. So
Mm-hmm.
the identification, the quantification and qualification, you need to risk rank them low through critical.
Mm-hmm.
What can take your company down? And then once you do kind of that administrative work, put them in a continuous monitoring program. A point in time assessment, a questionnaire, even something like a SOC 2 report. They're all good indicators, but as soon as they are complete, that information is no longer it's static. It can change at any time. So I would be laser focused. It's August 12th, 2025. The biggest risk right now in my mind is location risk, because so many things
Mm-hmm.
encompass that. Track what is going on at the location of your suppliers. Within that, ESG, compliance, regulatory environment falls under compliance. Always financial. I feel like traditionally it was cyber and financial were the two big ones. Those are, of course, not going away. Those are massive areas where risks can emerge. And then operations. And I think utilizing, a tool like Supply Wisdom that's doing this for you, it's utilizing the latest technology. It has, professional analysts verifying and validating the data. It can do external, some more digging for you from an analytical perspective. that's where I would focus. So after you identify and classify your outsourced population, I would start 100% with the locations that those vendors are operating out of, and then look across those 5 other domains. So cyber, ESG, compliance, operations, and location risk.
Outstanding. So last question, and this may, we could, at the risk of sounding like this is a total sales pitch, and it's not designed to be, but can a smaller to mid-sized enterprises afford a supply wisdom, or is this clearly only a tool for the G500?
Absolutely. So we have a very unique and I think special way that, we sell unlimited seats. So we go by our licensing is by the number of suppliers or locations you monitor. So you pay, say you pay to monitor the United States, China, and 5 companies. Anyone at your company has access to that information. So really, we want it to be widely used across organizations because the information is valuable to anyone and everyone, really, because everyone touches a vendor, whether you're the business relationship owner, you're an end user, everyone should be aware of what's going on. So we sell on a license based on the number of targets you're monitoring through us with unlimited seats. So absolutely. And we're very flexible with our pricing packages because we know how incredibly important this is. And that, it's no longer just the big banks, or the insurance agencies or the healthcare providers that need this. It's everyone.
Jenna, I can't thank you enough for being on. This discussion is eye-opening.
No, thank you for having me.
Part 2 on this one. Yeah, I know, no worries at all. For our audience who need help in this area and getting a handle on this, I highly recommend they seek you out. Because I think that you have a breadth and depth of experience and as does supply wisdom that makes you a unique player in this space, and a wealth of resource. I appreciate you bringing that wealth of resource to us here at Bourbon Bytes. Last question, do you drink? And if so, what do you drink?
Oh, I mean,
it's Bourbon Bytes, by the way. So,
loaded a question. I know, actually, when Mike reached out to me, I was like, oh man, I want to like bourbon. I don't. I guess, pull my tail. I'm a big red wine fan. I do love a glass of Cabernet.
There you go. All right.
But no, I can't. Terry, thank you so much. And for those who, I could talk about this all day. I'm so passionate about it. And I think it's so interesting because it's so evolving. So it's just such a great path.
And I don't mean to be a sycophant here, but I really don't know how a company would do this well without a tool like Supply Wisdom. Again, I'm not. I didn't mean this to be a complete endorsement, but clearly the aspects and the depth and breadth of the problem set require a capability. You can't just do this on a spreadsheet.
I would say to your question, you can't do it without tools. You absolutely must use tools. To stay ahead and maintain regulatory compliance.
Absolutely. Well, I look forward to us doing this again in round 2.
Absolutely.
And I really do appreciate you spending time with us today, Jenna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Terry. It's been great.